Um, Today, I'm just going to look at kind of part of the history of the telescope and take a particular angle, trying, in a sense, to tie together the technical development with its impact on the popular imagination. And what I'll do is focus on four phases of the history of the telescope between its invention and the mid-19th century, and look at how a set of issues that arose in the wake of its invention shaped the way the telescope was thought about, not only as a scientific instrument, but also as a symbol of science itself. And although it's not my specific focus, you'll, quite unsurprisingly, notice how the Royal Society and its fellows crop up again and again in the story. And you can also afterwards see some stuff from the Royal Society that's relevant to this story on display at the front. But let's start at the beginning, 50 years before this society was even founded. Now, skipping over the many uncertainties about the prehistory and invention of the telescope, we know that in the autumn of 1608, a spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey arrived in The Hague to see the commander of the Dutch armies, who at that time was in peace negotiations with the Spanish armies. This young man had a letter saying that he was the inventor of a new instrument, simply a tube containing two glass lenses, by means of which all things at a very great distance can be seen as if they were nearby. And it's from this relatively minor incident that the telescope, as it was named a couple of years later, spread rapidly across Europe, prized above all as a military device. That said, an earlier report noted that even the stars, which ordinarily are invisible to our sight, can be seen by means of this instrument. And by the following year, we have very specific evidence of a telescope being used for quite serious astronomy in Thomas Harriot's lunar observations with a six-powered trunk, as he called it, at Zion House, west of London, in the summer of 1609. This is the point where Galileo Galilei enters the story and becomes its central figure. For although he wasn't the telescope's inventor, he was very quick to exploit its potential. Having worked out its principles, he made more powerful instruments, showing an 8-powered version for spotting enemy ships to the Venetian Senate in the August of 1609. And by the autumn of that year, he was looking to the heavens too. Now, just a little bit of background. Even at this date, the accepted worldview was the one represented on the left, that the heavenly bodies were held in spheres revolving around a stationary Earth, and that everything in the regions from the moon outwards was made of an entirely different matter from that of the earthly sphere, and also that all heavenly bodies were perfect and unchanging. Those are important points I'll come back to. The Copernican hypothesis that, in fact, the sun was the centre of the universe had been proposed in 1543, but was not, by this time, even in the early 17th century, accepted as physically true. Now, almost as soon as Galileo began observing, what he saw with his telescope challenged the classical view. And it was really quite remarkable, so much so that this ambitious man rushed his findings into print, publishing the Sidereus Nuncius the following March, so that's 1610. And in that book, he claimed to have discovered that the moon had mountains and valleys, that the Milky Way was made of individual stars, that there were stars that the unaided eye couldn't see, and that Jupiter had 4 moons circling around it. Now, each of those posed very serious challenges to the established worldview. In particular, they really challenged the idea that the celestial bodies were unchanging and held in these unchanging, perfect spheres, all moving around a central Earth. As one supporter said, it was a bold deed to have penetrated the adamantine ramparts of heaven with such frail aid of crystal. Now, I've just brought up these two images of Galileo. On the left, one that first appeared in 1613, and was reproduced a number of times afterwards, and then a portrait from quite late in his life, only a few years before his death. And they both make very particular points about the telescope and its role in Galileo's life and his thinking. The image on the left shows Putty above him, really symbolizing two aspects of astronomy. On the left, you have the traditional astronomy done with mathematical angle measuring instruments, which is about mapping the heavens. But on the right, a new form of astronomy, which is about discovery of new celestial objects with the telescope. And then on the right, say from late in his life, Galileo shown in old age, the kind of venerable statesman, if you like, with the telescope as kind of his iconic device, something that sums up a key part of his life. So they present quite a simple narrative that the telescope changed ways of doing astronomy and helped found a new way of thinking about the universe. But the true story is not as simple as that. Galileo's claims certainly caught people's attention right from the start. On the day of publication of Sidereus Nuncius, Sir Henry Wotton, English ambassador to Venice, called that book the strangest piece of news ever yet received from any part of the world. But their eventual impact of the ideas presented in that book really had to be negotiated as people began to assimilate the implications and, crucially, to think about the limitations of the telescope and of the evidence it offered. And it's the concerns that surrounded these negotiations that lie at the heart of many later representations of the telescope and of its users. Now, in a sense, the early challenges to Galileo's claims shouldn't be a surprise. Technically, the first telescopes were of very limited capability. The first telescopes were this Dutch or Galilean arrangement with two lenses, a concave eye lens and a convex object lens. And one of the great drawbacks of that is you get a very limited field of view. So this is what the moon looks like through one of these telescopes, and all you're seeing is a small part of the moon, only about a quarter of the moon. So you can't see much, and it's very hard to keep targets in view. I've made one of these, sad to say, and they are incredibly difficult to use. Now, in 1611, Kepler came up with an alternate arrangement using two convex lenses, the great advantage of which was that you have a much wider field of view, so with an equivalent magnification, you'd be able to see the whole of the moon. The disadvantage was that the image was upside down, so actually this image should be the other way up, which meant it was no good for terrestrial use. So it's not really much used, the Keplerian system, until the 1640s. But on top of this kind of inherent limitation of the Dutch or Galilean telescope, all telescopes had major limitations in that the glass lenses suffered from defects of spherical and chromatic aberration, producing blurred images with distracting colour displacements, which is a problem not solved, as we'll see, until the middle of the next century. So it was difficult to see clearly with the best telescopes available, and many of these first telescopes just weren't the best. So what was often the case was that observers would look through a not-so-good instrument, and they just wouldn't be able to see what Galileo said he saw through his telescope. So quite reasonably, they doubted the claims he was making. And hand in hand with this technical problem, there's also a conceptual issue, or a set of conceptual issues. It just wasn't a given that what the telescope appeared to show could be accepted without question. Having passed through glass, were the images real, or were they artificial products of the instrument itself? If the terrestrial and heavenly regions were, as still generally supposed, made of entirely different matter, did the optical principles on which the telescope was based operate in the same way in both regions? And were these observations even worth making? Weren't they distracting one from the more important business of following a virtuous path in life? So these are things that all have to be addressed at this time. Thinking about this question of the reality of the observations, Galileo began to demonstrate his instrument in person, so literally one-to-one, trying to persuade people that what they're seeing is reality. And this had mixed results. After reviewing in April 1610, a very biased observer, Martin Hawkey, wrote to Kepler that Galileo came to us in Bologna and he brought with him that spyglass through which he sees fictitious planets. On Earth it works miracles, in the heavens it deceives. All acknowledged that the instrument deceived, and Galileo became silent, and on the 26th, a Monday, dejected, he took his leave. Plenty of others were as hostile as Hawke. Cesare Cremonini refused to look through a telescope lest it gave him a headache. Sadly, not from some superstitious fear of what the instrument would do, but because really he saw telescopic observation as a pointless exercise. Now, these very general conceptual issues, is it reality, is it fiction, were resolved fairly quickly. As early as 1611, official confirmation came from the leading mathematicians of the Jesuit College in Rome that Galileo's astronomical observations were indeed real. They were showing something that was out there. But what the Jesuit fathers did in giving that pronouncement was to shift the debate. They said, okay, the observations are real, but what we have a problem with is Galileo's interpretation of those observations. So they denied Galileo's inference that the moon was mountainous. Sure enough, it didn't look smooth. It doesn't look smooth to the naked eye. But this didn't prove that it was not a perfectly smooth sphere, they argued. That appearance could arise from a non-uniform density. And this is the characteristic of the next phase of the telescope in astronomy. For each reported observation, there was immense debate about what that meant. Let's take just one example, the phases of Venus. Here the stakes were very high. Both the Earth and Sun-centered systems required Venus to have phases of some sort, but they predicted different sorts of phases, a different range of phases. In the Sun-centered model, you would have the full range from crescent to full. On 11th of December 1610, Galileo recorded a breakthrough in this question, sending a coded message to Giuliana de Medici. The mother of love emulates the figure of Cynthia. In other words, Venus exhibits a full set of phases like the moon. Now, his friend Benedetto Castelli was delighted with this. He thought this is undeniable proof of the heliocentric system, something no one can deny. Galileo, clearly a bit jaded by this time, was less optimistic, writing in response, "You almost made me laugh when you said that with these manifest observations, the obstinate could be convinced. Don't you know that to convince the pig-headed, who care only for the empty applause of the stupid and dull crowd, the testimony of the stars come down to earth to discuss themselves would not suffice?" So what Galileo is coming to realize is that the telescope alone and its observations alone aren't necessarily going to change people's minds. And so it proved those wishing to keep the Earth in its privileged place at the center of the universe denied his interpretation. And what I've put up here is the frontispiece from Giovanni Battista Riccioli's Almagestum Novum of 1651. Riccioli was a Jesuit mathematician and astronomer, and his text really sets the agenda for Catholic doctrine in terms of universal systems. So on the one hand, he presents the telescope as an instrument that gives you the truth. So on the left, the figure that maybe Riccioli, but it certainly adopts the figure of Argos, the 100-eyed giant from Greek mythology, holds a telescope and in fact is looking through it with his knee eye, and saying videbo kalos tuos opera digator tur, roughly, I see your heavens, your handiwork. And interestingly, I've produced this detail on the right where he's showing things like, here, the phases of Venus. So these are real observations. But the frontispiece also discusses world systems. Discarded at the bottom is the Ptolemaic Earth-centered system. But being weighed up are, on the left, the heliocentric system, and on the right, a compromise system which kept the Earth at the center of the universe, but had the other planets revolving around the sun. A system attributed or deriving from Tycho Brahe. And here, they're being weighed up, and the compromise system is found to be the victor. So for those wishing to keep the Earth at the centre, even in the 1650s, there was a system that could do that. And the telescope wasn't giving the answer that everyone said it was. So my point is that the telescope raised questions, but didn't always give unequivocal answers. And the concerns that its critics raised, that it distorted vision, produced false images, and distracted one from more important work, haunted it thereafter, becoming enshrined in satiric images of the instrument and its users. And this initially precarious position was well expressed, for example, by Sir Henry Wotton, who, again, on the day of publication of the Sidereus Nuncius, observed that Galileo was doomed to be exceeding famous or exceeding ridiculous. And the English playwright Thomas Tomkis followed this latter line in his play Albumazar of 1615. In one scene, Ronca, one of the astrologer's sidekicks, tries to impress his intended dupe Pandolfo by showing him Albumazar's perspicacy. Tomkis deliberately using an anglicized version of the perspicillum that Galileo had used in the Sidereus Nuncius to describe his spyglass, later the telescope. And this device he describes as an engine to catch stars, a maze to arrest the planets. And in a rather fanciful description, Ronca claims that he can use this marvellous device to read the Iliad in a nutshell 12 miles off, or gaze into the Vatican, and that the device will draw the moon so near that you would swear the bush of thorns in it prick your eyes. Yet Pandolfo, when he uses this instrument, sees none of this. When he looks through it, he sees only a richly dressed crowd, the audience. But what you can see here is that Tomkis is drawing on the same doubts that the contemporaries of Galileo were expressing very seriously. Doubts in kind of deriving from the operational limitations of the new device. And it was the first solutions to these limitations that feature in the next leg of the journey. Now, as I've mentioned, telescope lenses suffered from various defects, and despite improvements in production, makers came to the conclusion that these defects could not be wholly eliminated. Instead, the best way of reducing distortions was to grind lenses with small curvatures, and hence much longer focal lengths, and to restrict the aperture of the lenses. So as the use of telescopes for astronomy took off, their length steadily increased to accommodate these lenses. By the 1650s, the best astronomical telescopes were over 20 feet long. 20 years later, they could be twice that length. And what I've got here are two images. On the left, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, painted in about 1690, with what you can see in the garden behind the main observatory building is a 60-foot telescope attached to an 80-foot mast, perfectly demonstrating the problems. It started swaying dangerously in 1690 and was removed by the end of the century. And another image, a detail from Spratt's first history of the Royal Society, and amongst the instruments dotted around this frontispiece, the instruments that are the basis of the new age of reason, based on the new philosophy, is this long mast telescope, perhaps modelled on the one that Hooke had been using in recent years. It can be no coincidence, however, that at exactly the same time, we begin to see equally long telescopes being made fun of in poems and plays featuring virtuosi, foolish dabblers in science, oblivious to the real world about them. A long and cumbersome telescope was an ideal prop in these plays. The stage directions for Aphra Behn's The Emperor of the Moon call for a telescope of 20 feet or more, with which the appropriately short-sighted Dr. Baliardo makes his lunar observations. Like any good virtuoso, Baliardo is utterly distracted by these observations. His daughter's lover easily persuades him, therefore, that the moon's emperor has really come down to Earth to claim her as a bride. The astronomers who used these unwieldy instruments, audiences were to understand, were easily fooled because their thoughts lay elsewhere. And Samuel Butler's satirical poem, The Elephant in the Moon, took this further. It tells of a group of virtuosi, and I've put up a painting on the left, which, although it's late 18th century, the clothing suggests it's harking back to an earlier period and represents exactly the sort of meeting that Butler is talking about in The Elephant in the Moon. A group of virtuosi in that poem observing with their optic engine, who think they see a battle raging on the moon's surface with an elephant caught up in it. Carried away by their speculations and thoughts of the fame their amazing discoveries will bring them, they really can't understand that they're seeing something a little bit more mundane. To quote Butler's relentless rhyming scheme, so apologies for my reading, it's one of the footboys who, viewing well, discovered more than all the learned had done before. Quoth he, "A little thing is slunk into the long star-gazing trunk, and now is gotten down so nigh, I have him just against mine eye." On opening the telescope, the battling figures are found to be flies and gnats, the elephant nothing more than a mouse. Instruments like the telescope, Butler suggests, cannot help those whose moral blindness leads them to deny the truth before their eyes. And his meaning was all the more explicit because his virtuosi were clearly identifiable as specific fellows of the Royal Society. Sir Paul Neal, John Evelyn, Robert Hooke, Robert Boyle, and others. And Butler also deployed a telescope in the mock epic Hudibras, which appeared in 3 parts in the 1660s and 70s, in which the hero, Hudibras, consults the astrologer Sidrafel, outside whose house stands an obelisk. So here's shown in a Hogarth engraving of a later edition. And to quote, "From top of this there hung a rope to which he fastened telescope, the spectacles with which the stars he reads in smallest characters." But like the virtuosi of The Elephant in the Moon, the astrologer is fooled by his telescopic observations, mistaking a lantern hung from a kite for a terrible omen of the world's end. Like his brethren at the Royal Society, Sidrafel fails to see what would be clear to ordinary people. Either that, or he goes to painful lengths to discover the blindingly obvious, using his telescope to find out whether the moon is full or the sky cloudy. So in Butler's world, at best the telescope reveals only what is obvious anyway. At worst, it creates false knowledge. But in this same period, the late 17th century, we get some more elegant solutions to the telescope's technical problems being developed. Famously, in December 1671, Isaac Newton sent to the Royal Society a telescope that used a mirror instead of a lens to gather light. And the sketch on the right is of this 1671 instrument. The surviving instrument in the Royal Society, of which there's a replica on the table, is probably of one made the following year. This small reflecting telescope came out of his groundbreaking optical researches in the previous decade, which showed that white light is made from a mixture of different colours that are separated when it passes through a prism or a lens. This was the cause of the coloured fringes that plagued all lens-based telescopes, and meant, he believed, that it was impossible to correct that defect. So Newton turned his attention to building a telescope with mirrors, since light is not split by reflection. And in 1668, he built his first one, and then later on 2 more, which are the ones that come to the Royal Society. And then is the following century that the reflecting telescope really becomes a commercial proposition, particularly once the problems of grinding mirrors were overcome, and that's the chief technical problem with reflecting telescopes. This commercial success characterised in the work of James Short, a Scottish-born instrument maker who made his fortune as he described himself, optician solely for reflecting telescopes. And it's in Short's time that reflecting telescopes really become an icon of the new natural philosophy that Newton's followers were promoting, and promoting quite aggressively. So here on the right, we have the frontispiece to Benjamin Martin's Young Gentlemen and Ladies' Philosophy, one of very many works popularising science for the wealthy classes. At heart, it shows Newtonian science as a proper topic for civilised conversation between gentlemen and gentlewomen. So here we have the 2 main characters of the book, Cleonicus and his sister Euphrosyne, sitting in a well-furnished room, a telescope and a globe centre stage as fine possessions and tools for learning. And it's these tools that Cleonicus uses to teach his sister about the universe and its operations. And Martin's claim here is that these instruments reveal moral and useful knowledge. Knowledge of the workings of God's universe strengthens religious faith. And while Euphrosyne admits that she is too embarrassed to display her learning, worrying that it looks so masculine for a woman to talk of philosophy in company, Cleonicus assures her that this new knowledge will in fact make her a better marriage prospect. The scientifically learned Euprepia, he tells her, is now admired, esteemed, and beloved by all gentlemen of discernment. It's quite a contrast to a generation earlier, when James Miller's play, The Humours of Oxford, warned that a woman makes as ridiculous a figure poring over globes or through a telescope as a man would with a pair of preservers mending lace. Possessing telescopes and other instruments is also about presenting the image, this image, of a gentleman or gentlewoman of learning. Owning a fine telescope makes you a fine person, Martin implies. Coincidentally, he could sell you one at his shop in Fleet Street. Now, I'll come back to what satirists made of the claims of Martin and his contemporaries. But I should just mention a second technical advance of the mid-18th century, and that's the achromatic lens. This was patented by John Dolland in 1758 and was made of two different types of glass. And I won't go into the details. Basically, it was the solution to the optical defects from which all lens-based telescopes suffered. Its introduction was a revolution, therefore, allowing smaller, better, and more powerful instruments to be made in large numbers and making the telescope an increasingly visible accessory. So I've just put up two images of George III, who evidently was short-sighted and used a spyglass to help himself. And a lot of the satirical prints of the Georgian period use this image of George with the spyglass to really emphasize his kind of distraction from worldly events, his ignorance of what's going on around him, as he was presented as an increasingly foolish or mad king. And that's certainly what you have on the left in More Ships or Good News from Copenhagen. On the right, actually, that idea has been turned around because we have the king almost supernaturally spying out evil deeds with his spyglass. So that's an interesting opposite of that traditional image of the foolish George. And that image, the New Leaf for an Old Book of Common Prayer, actually draws on 17th century Protestant image, you know, with the Protestants being delivered from the Armada or the gunpowder plot. But what we have there is the telescope with almost supernatural powers. And quite a lot of satirical imagery draws on that idea that the telescope shows you deeper truths, so not just literal observational truths about the universe, but deeper things about society and about the people at the top of society. On the left, Hogarth's print, later called Royalty, Episcopacy and Law, drew on the solar eclipse of 1724. And what he shows is a view through a telescope to the inhabitants of the moon, as it's described. And what these are the figures of state with different attributes. Instead of being actually people, they're made up of emblems. So a coin instead of the king's head. And what he's showing you is that the telescope draws the people in power closer and reveals actually what they're really about, which is largely about money. So it's about revealing the corruption, the reality beneath the robes of power. And I rather like this image on the right from 1835 from the Looking Glass or Caricature Annual, which drew together monthly sheets of caricatures by Thomas Maclean. And you can see all dotted around the image, all these people with different telescopes who are kind of finally seeing the king for what he is. But these kind of positive renderings of telescopic power and superpower only tell part of the story. Now, at first glance, Robert Sayre's viewing the transit of Venus appears to be the same message that Newtonian advocates like Martin were putting out. One could easily see this as a well-heeled, learned, polite couple. But looking closer, there's perhaps something different going on. Firstly, the scene isn't really topical. This is printed in 1793. The most recent transit of Venus had taken place in 1769, so it's not about recent events. On the right, we have a satyr, a statue of a satyr, hinting at perhaps something a little more earthy going on. Emphasised, I would suggest, by the way in which the man is lightly fingering the telescope, suggesting perhaps it's akin to what contemporaries would describe as the staff of life. So perhaps Venus is the woman, and what he is hoping for is a more bodily transit of that Venus, recalling stories of the amorous encounters of the Greek goddess of love. So what we have here is a telescope that's a rather impolite instrument, and it certainly wasn't alone. Thomas Rowlandson is perhaps not the most subtle of satirists, and his humour is not necessarily the most up-to-date. The Progress of Gallantry delivers an obviously phallic symbol and highlights the telescope as an instrument not for celestial observation, but for very terrestrial, voyeuristic viewings. And looking at the comet till you get a crick in the neck was inspired by recent events, the Great Comet of 1811, also known as Napoleon's Comet. But the humour, such as it is, clearly harks back to that of the virtuoso of the 17th century. Here we have a pedantic, isolated, foolish seeker of knowledge, oblivious to what is happening under his nose and in his very house. The telescope, an instrument of distraction, with mildly sexual or perhaps asexual, in his case, connotations. And you can note things like the tail that he's given and the positioning of the woman's arm, perhaps. I won't dwell on that. And this kind of telescopic satire might extend, forgive the pun, beyond criticism of scientific practitioners. Here's a lovely print from the Royal Society. This is, in fact, a recreated image. It's about Samuel Richardson, and the story goes that when Hogarth first drew it, he showed it to Richardson, who was, for some reason, a little disturbed by it, and so Hogarth threw it into the fire, and then it was recreated from Walpole's description of it. The text at the bottom draws on Samuel Richardson's explanatory notes and remarks on Milton's Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, of course, being a text that draws heavily on the telescope for its imagery. Styling himself in that book, The Complicated Richardson, hence the title of this, he wrote that, "My naked eye is as no eye at all on this occasion. I then apply to my telescope. In what depends on the knowledge of the learned languages, my sun is my telescope." So in Hogarth's rendition, the sun, who is the one standing up with a telescope extending into his naked eye, mediates between the works of art on the shelves and his father at the table. As the art historian Ronald Paulson has written, Hogarth picks up Galileo's telescope with its ambivalent associations of perception aided as misperception and applies it directly to connoisseurship. So what we have here is Hogarth saying that just as telescope lenses might distort, so the critic connoisseur does as he mediates, and mediates quite falsely, between artists and the public. So he's not a great fan of art critics. So what we see in the 18th and 19th century satirical tradition is that the images are drawing on the issues that arose in the 1610s: distraction, distortion, degeneracy. And moving on to my last leg, I want to look at the legacy of William Herschel, another of the great figures in the history of the telescope. While James Short made the reflecting telescope a popular and profitable commodity, it was Herschel who turned it into an important astronomical tool, in particular his discovery of the planet Uranus in 1781, with one of the telescopes made by him and his family. And it was this that gave him scientific credibility and made him an international celebrity, a name to conjure with. And here's a print that begins to do just that. Rowlandson again. The Astronomer, as it's titled, appeared as part of the English Dance of Death, a series of scenes showing death conducting persons of all rank, conditions, and ages to the tomb, each accompanied by a verse narrative. It's an old tradition that Rowlandson picks up. There's, Holbein's Dance of Death, most famously, from the 16th century. And what Rowlandson does is update it. So he has things like the insurance office, the lottery office, and here, the astronomer. In this particular tableau, the astronomer, Master Senex, clearly recalls again the virtuoso. Like them, he is lost in his studies, and to quote, never for one moment thought, but of the sciences he taught. He never did the fancy seas of ploughing land or planting trees. So he's not interested in practical utilitarian outcomes. The rather inaccurately depicted, it has to be said, telescope is central, emphasizing his detachment from more domestic things. Particularly there's something going on in the corner, suggesting that perhaps he is missing things in more senses than one. And while he does see something through the telescope and sees a sort of truth, it's not the Herschelian discovery that he was anticipating. To quote the verse again, "Oh, this will be a precious boon. Herschel's volcanoes in the moon are naught to this," old Senex said. "My fortune is forever made." "It is, indeed," a voice replied. The old man heard it, terrified, and as fear threw him to the ground, through the long tube death gave the wound. So a very traditional image of the virtuoso coming to his untimely end. Staying with the Herschel family, my closing tale moves us forward another 20 years. In 1833, John Herschel, son of William and an eminent astronomer in his own right, sailed to South Africa with his family and a number of telescopes. And they set up at a house at Veldhuizen near Cape Town. And it was here that he erected a 20-foot reflector that had originally been built by William Herschel and his family. And John used it to map the southern skies before returning to England 5 years later in 1838. Now, these Cape observations were very successful. They were a good set of astronomical results. But they also spawned a notorious hoax. And this started on 21st of August 1835, when the New York Sun made a brief announcement of some celestial discoveries by John Herschel, using what they described as an immense telescope of an entirely new principle. This was followed by a series of longer reports a few days later, which described the discoveries at greater length, supported with lengthy scientific-sounding explanations. The telescope apparently united all the meritorious points in the Gregorian and Newtonian instruments with the highly interesting achromatic discovery of Dollond. So it's good name checking here. Over successive days, the reports escalated. The moon, they revealed, was alive first with plants, then also with birds and curious animals. These included a spherical amphibian, bluish creatures like unicorns, and beavers very like those on Earth, although they lacked a tail, walked on 2 feet, and knew how to make fire. Then, readers learned of a race of winged humanoids living in pastoral harmony near beautiful temples of polished sapphire. Herschel and his companions had, they read, scientifically named these lunar beings Vespertilio Homo, or man-bat, perhaps Batman. As the reports escalated, so did the Sun's circulation, and news spread far and wide as other papers and journals ran with the story. And here's just one representation of the story from a German snuff box, currently on display in the History of Science Museum in Oxford. So apparently showing John Herschel in the centre, and the kind of strange device is the telescope represented there, and then on the table are his observations of some of the lunar inhabitants. An American clergyman was said to have warned his clergy, his congregation, that he might ask them for donations to buy Bibles to send to the moon's inhabitants. Herschel later complained that he had been pestered from all quarters in English, French, Italian, and German, although his wife was moved to admit that the whole description is so well clenched with minute details of workmanship and names of individuals boldly referred to that the New Yorkists were not to be blamed for actually believing it. A few days later, however, largely because various newspapers were picking up on this story and asking more and more questions, Richard Adams Locke was forced to reveal that it was all a hoax, a satire on those claiming there was life on other planets. What I find interesting in this hoax, this satire, is that to achieve the satire, he had actually played with the idea that the telescope really was, as science's advocates claimed, an instrument that revealed the truth, uncovering marvellous new things about the universe. So I think Locke's playing with a positive reading of the telescope and using that to successfully hoodwink all those willing to accept the most preposterous claims, just as long as they're backed up with sufficiently scientific-sounding verbiage. Journalists are still good at that. Now, that's as far as I have time to take the story today, but it's worth noting that many of these same themes recur through the 19th century into more recent times in cartoons, film, TV, other media. There's a lovely example I was watching the other day, 1941's The Wolf Man, very fine horror film, where there's actually a very lovely large refracting telescope introduced early on in the film, which does no astronomical observation, although later on the lead character, Lon Chaney, playing Larry Talbot, says, "You see, a telescope has a mighty sharp eye. It brings the stars so close that you feel you can almost touch them." But he goes on, and it does the same thing to people in their rooms. That is, if you point it in the right direction. And that's exactly what he's done. And you also, in things like Heath Robinson's sketch, Searching for Halley's Comet at Greenwich Observatory, get Edwardian virtuosi at work with their fabulous instrument. So I say these themes carry on. So while the telescope has, by and large, become established as an icon of serious scientific exploration, one need think no further than Hubble. The idea that it might be a tool for less wholesome pursuits or the frivolous obsessions of the foolish is still a very easy one to find even today. So keep looking out, you never know where you'll find it. Thank you very much.